Okay, I am going to continue with this recording in the hopes that it's helpful, and we can spend our class time talking about other things. Today, what I want to do, or this first thing that I want to do, is to talk. So this part now is thinking about the worldviews of the folks that arrived and the context from which they came. So we're looking now at pre-colonial Iberia, the pre-colonial Iberian world. And as I talk about this, I want you to think about what you know now, or what you have a sense of the worldviews and the way of understanding things, the cosmology, society of indigenous people before the arrival of Europeans. And think about these people that I'm talking about through their eyes. Think about how they might have understood folks that I'm describing, or just think about how different it is. But I want you to kind of hear what I am going to try to get you to understand these people as well, these Europeans. But now that you understand something of the indigenous folks, rather than thinking about just, what Europeans must have thought when they encountered indigenous people, that'll be a part of what's going on in these lectures. But I'd like you to also think about, from the perspective of what you know about how indigenous people understood the world, how they might have understood these people. More of that will be explicitly talked about when we actually get into talking about the colonial encounters, the early ones, and then building the society and the sort of changes, cultural, religious, social changes that are happening in those early years. But I want you to keep it in mind now. So I have two parts to this. I'm not sure how much I'll get to it right now, but I'll post what I can, and then we'll move on, and I'll see some of it I may just deliver to you in class or share with you in class. But I've divided these thoughts up into two ways. One is a kind of religio-political vision, religious, cultural, political vision, that is carried by the people that arrived and were the most impactful in the early years. So the folks that came come from this larger context that carries both a kind of, you might call, almost like high religion or high politics, sort of the way that I was talking about the Aztecs and the Inca versus people who are subject peoples and solving problems in their ordinary day-to-day lives. There's a division here too. None of these divisions, it's not really like official religion and popular religion. It's more like local religion and state religion, or local culture and state culture, or local politics and state politics. It's more like that. And so there's overlap between that. So you have, a religious expert, whether they are, or a high priest, whether they're European or Mexica, and they are operating in an official context or acting out of a particular kind of state endowed authority. And from that perspective, they are speaking about the world in a certain way. They see the world in a certain way, but they also, were kids at some point, and they grew up in a particular place that had a particular geography, that was near a certain river, that had its local, nature and divine forces, and its local rituals and local rhythms of celebrations, et cetera, et cetera. And so, and that isn't gone when that person moves into a position of authority. So it's not a division necessarily that exists, like some people think this and some people think this. It's more like there are different levels of vision. Think about our own politicians. There's a kind of ideology that you hear coming from the White House, for instance, that has a sort of national, a national vision. But then those people also grew up in a town and had their favorite coffee shop. And, if they went to church, they went to a local church that had its particular traditions and rhythms, etc. So just keep that in mind. But the division that I want to do is sort of looking at that state perspective first, and talk to you about the context out of which a particular kind of Iberian religio-political vision, a particular kind of apocalyptic Christianity, and how, and when I'm talking about this sort of religion, I'm not only talking about religion, I'm talking about politics. I'm talking about this vision, this force that comes to the shores of the Americas, and how it was forged in the context of the long history of war with Islam, and the forging of this entity called Spain. So I'm going to be talking about that, and I'm going to be talking about the vision that the friars brought and the missionaries brought, and also a vision that was in part forged in this very process of exploration and things like that, but has a long history, and parts of the history were activated even more strongly in the colonial encounter. So that's the sort of thing I'm going to talk about today, or talk about right now, as much as I can get through. And then the second part, which I'll deliver at some point, is more thinking about that, the sort of everyday cosmology, everyday religion, everyday politics, everyday culture of people living in Iberia prior to 1492 and at the moment of 1492. And there, one of the things that I want you to notice is that you'll notice that some of the sort of stark division between the natural and the supernatural, or some of the things that seem so stark in this state version of the religio-political vision of Spaniards, for lack of a better word, that seems so different between them and indigenous people, is not quite so different when you take a look at the kind of ordinary practices of people. And so both of those things arrived because the humans that arrived brought both of those traditions with them. And so when you try to think about the colonial encounter, you're going to see two things. When you see authority figures talking to authority figures, or when you see the efforts of the official church or the civil authorities trying to impose cultural forms and reorganize society, you're going to see this state political vision, religio-political vision at work. But when you look at the rituals and traditions and ordinary practices that persist, indigenous peoples' religious practices, and also cultural forms and local authority, etc., and social organizations that persist, and you see the way that they change subtly, and you see that the way that the new kind of colonial culture that emerges out of it, a lot of that is interaction between these more enduring ordinary forms of cosmology, of worldview, of Europeans interacting with that of the local forms of indigenous people. So there's a parallel here, right? Smaller, local, ordinary, everyday is what lasts. The big state stuff is what leaves the most impact. It's in terms of documents. It leaves the most enduring records, historical records, but it is also the stuff that seems to crumble or change most dramatically. Obviously, there's legacies. There's legacies of both. So this is what I'm going to try to convey to you today, the first part. I don't think I'm going to be able to get through all of it before I actually going to see you all in just a moment. This is my office, by the way. These are some little drawings from my daughter way long ago. I need to get some new ones. All right, so a few introductory words. So perhaps at this point, after we've talked about pre-colonial indigenous cosmology and cultural traditions and worldviews, it may be that those seem very different and very far away from us today. But it's important to realize that in many ways, medieval and early modern Europeans were just as different from us, just as far away from us. There are certain things we share with them that we do not share with pre-colonial indigenous people in terms, if we say what we mean by we, is like the political structures we've inherited, the dominant culture and things like that. Certain cultural concepts that were very powerful in medieval and early modern Europe are still very much at work in our society today, but nonetheless, there were really big differences. The cosmology of Europeans that came to Latin America was very unlike the reigning cosmology of our modern, supposedly secular post-19th century society that we live in today. So here today, I want us to explore a bit about those particular differences so you can understand the kind of people and not assume that they look much like us who arrived in the Americas. So as I said, I want to give you a sense of some of the large-scale religious and cultural forces at work that would shape the way Spaniards in particular would experience their encounter with what they called the New World, and through which indigenous people would experience them. And then how, these things would shape what they did once they were there. In a sense, today, or in this part of today anyways, what I'm going to be talking to you about is the kind of development of Christianity, of a particular kind of European Christianity as an identity, as a national, ethnic, and eventually imperial identity. This is the story that I'm going to be talking to you about that leads up to 1492. And then later, I'll talk more about the ordinary stuff, which does show up in the people who come. So today we'll be talking about a Christian identity forged in war, and a Christianity that was very important to kings and queens, as well as many clergymen and other educated religious people. But it's also true that these individuals had their own private faith practices, as I mentioned, and many of them were not so different from farmers and servants, for instance. On the other side of things, it's also true that, ordinary people, people with less power than kings and queens and princes, and even friars and priests, like foot soldiers and blacksmiths and servant women, also traveled alongside of these priests and, would end up being conquerors in their own right, and that they were also affected by the apocalyptic fervor of the times that I'm going to be talking about today. So religious nationalism really is a language that we could talk about this, and it certainly was present in bishops and kings and queens and priests, but it also impacted ordinary people as well. So a few things that are extremely important for understanding Iberian peoples and what became Spain as it operated in the New World. One is the relationship between faith and war, the relationship between the idea of God and kingdom, and the third is the relationship between blood and religion, or put another way, between ideas of race, ethnicity, and religious identity. Two things are central to all of these relationships in the Iberian Peninsula. One is the legacy of the Roman Empire. And then two is the long history of the struggle against non-Christians. The most significant of these struggles is the centuries of war with Islam, the most significant in terms of the things that formed the particular institutions and ideas through which the early conquest was enacted. The long history of anti-Semitism and the long history of a different kind of conflict between Christians and Jews would also shape the other things, other ways that people related in a long, sort of enduring way to formerly non-Christian people, indigenous people, once they had converted to Christianity. So we'll talk about that too, but that is not going to come up as much in this first lecture, because we're talking about kind of a religious nationalism that was deeply formed by 700 years of war with Islamic peoples and forces. So the combination of these legacies, the memory of the Roman Empire and the long struggle between Christians and non-Christians, particularly with Islam, together with the kind of political particular political, military, and cultural events of the late Middle Ages led to a kind of Christianity that was a kind of political Christianity, religious nationalism that was fervent and zealous, and in some cases utopian or apocalyptic, often militaristic, and tied to ideas about political power and victory. This is very important. It's not religion being justified or politics being justified through religion. This is a kind of religious nationalism in which the two are part and parcel of the same thing. It was not unlike, in many ways, the imperial religious visions or the imperial worldviews of the Aztec and the Inca Empire, except that Spain, as an actual unified political entity, was far younger than even the Aztec or the Incan Empire at the time the Spaniards arrived in the Americas. Politically, the Kingdom of Spain really only began in 1492, the same year that Columbus stumbled upon the Americas. This year marked this victorious end to more than 700 years of military struggle against Islamic rule in the Iberian Peninsula. And during these many centuries, these 7 centuries, the idea of Spain, referred to as Hispania, Hispania, the idea of Spain was forged through war, through religious war, through religious nationalist war. For most of the Middle Ages, the region that is now modern Spain was broken up into a number of smaller kingdoms. These kingdoms spoke variants of the Spanish language, but most of which could not be understood by people from the other kingdoms. The concept of Spain or España as a region came from earlier periods when the Iberian Peninsula was a part of larger empires. First the Roman Empire and then the German Visigoth Empire. So we're talking about the Christian Roman Empire once the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity and then insisted that Christianity became the imperial religion, and the Germanic Visigoth Empire, which was a Christian empire. So Hispania, Hispania, as opposed to España. Hispania was what the Romans called the Iberian Peninsula, which is an area that includes modern Portugal, Spain, Andorra, Gibraltar, and a part of southern France. And the Roman rule of this area stretched from, we have to do another timeline here, from 2012 BC to 400 AD. So Christians were present and persecuted in Hispania and throughout the Roman Empire until the Roman Emperor Constantine became a Christian and declared Christianity the official religion of the empire. And that happened in 325. Okay, so Roman rule stretched throughout this time, but it didn't become a Christian empire until the last 75 years of its existence, but as an empire, the Roman Empire. I hope that makes sense. So let me say that again. So Roman rule of Hispania, of this area that the Romans called Hispania, basically the Iberian Peninsula, which includes Spain, Portugal, Andorra, Gibraltar, and a small part of southern France. Roman rule of that area lasted from 2012 BC to 400 AD. In 325, the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity and halted the persecution of Christians, which had been going on for a long time, and insisted that and made Christianity the imperial religion. So for that last 75 years, the Iberian Peninsula, as a part of a much larger Christian Roman empire, was Christian. And so the idea of Spain, España, eventually came from the reality of Christian Roman rule in what they called Hispania. Okay, hopefully that made sense. Germanic Christian Visigoths conquered the region in 400 AD, but continued Christian rule then at that time. So Many scholars have said that it was actually during the Visigoth rule that a dream of Iberian unity began and sort of developed in this region, the regions that would later become Spain. The term Mother Hispania started being used at this time, about 400 AD, and for the next, 200 or 300 years. Mother Hispania started being used by political philosophers and poets and religious thinkers, etc. So there was a kind of dream of a unified Christian Iberia. Mother Hispania is what it was called. In 711 AD, Muslims from northern Africa invaded the Iberian Peninsula and quickly conquered the entire region. So, from 325 AD to 711 AD, this region was Christian. It still wasn't united. I mean, it was for 75 years a part of a larger Roman Empire, and then for a few hundred years part of, a Germanic empire. But it itself, the Iberian Peninsula, didn't belong to itself and wasn't united as a political entity, but there was a kind of imagination and a dream of this being so. But it was Christian officially. So in 711, Islamic rule took over the entire region. At the northern edge of the peninsula, in what was at the time the small kingdom of Castile, Christian resistors fled to the mountains of Asturias and began from this tiny little place. So basically, there was a tiny little Christian holdout in the kingdom of Castile that fought back and managed to maintain a little tiny Christian foothold. And they began from these mountains, these kind of guerrilla warfare folks began this long, protracted, periodic war that would end in 1492. And it was at this time, through this war from the north, little by little by little by little, over 700 years, this idea of Mother Spain developed into a dream of the return of the Holy Roman Empire, a Christian empire that would be led by Spain. So in this process, not only were people writing about and dreaming about a return to Christian rule and a unified Iberian Empire or Iberian Peninsula, but the thought that a global Christian empire that included the Middle East, that included all the regions that were formerly part of the Roman Empire, would return as a Christian empire with Spain at the helm. So, these visions forged in this long war and sort of desperate guerrilla warfare is what fueled this idea. So Christians in the north, organizing primarily from Castile, waged war against Islam and slowly pushed the Muslim frontier further and further south over the course of the next 7 centuries. And this is what came to be known as the Reconquista, or the reconquest of Spain. The concept of reconquest assumes that there was a Spain prior to the Muslim conquest, when in fact we know that the various kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula were all part of larger empires. But nonetheless, as these kingdoms threw off Muslim rule, they, did so in the name of this return of the Christian empire, but they didn't end up aligning with each other right away at all, but rather they returned to being independent kingdoms with their own monarchies. They sometimes forged alliances through marriage, joining one kingdom, temporarily with another, but they also might go to war with each other even after they had driven the Muslims out of that region. But at the same time, they did remain committed to the defense of Christianity as this nationalist sort of religion, and the battle against Islam, and continue to contribute to the attacks against Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula. So, reconquered kingdoms might immediately form return to their independent kingdoms. It might even be at war with each other at the same time as both of them were sending people and resources to the Muslim frontier to contribute to the war. So they were united in this effort, but they weren't necessarily united in any other way. As the Muslim frontier moved, more and more parts of what would become Spain were shaped by this culture of war and Christian nationalism, and the concept of the reconquest of a previously Christian land grew more and more important in people's minds. But remember that this happened very, very slowly over 7 centuries. Think about what 700 years means. And that for that whole entire time, large parts of Spain were under Muslim rule and were not under attack, that were not at war, were peacefully under Muslim rule. And during this long period of time, Islamic religion and culture and, mathematical, scientific advances and particular traditions flourished, particularly in the southern parts of the peninsula. So on an official level, Islamic rule was much more tolerant than of other religions than Christian rule would become once places were reconquered and became Christian kingdoms. So for this reason, this long era of reconquest in the places that are under Islamic rule has come to be known by scholars as the era of convivencia. And convivencia means living together, means coexisting, basically peacefully is what it implies. Of course, there are limits to this, and there are limits to the culture of tolerance, but it was a significant way that that people existed. Islamic, Muslims, Jews, and Christians interacted with each other, existed together. There was not, it wasn't illegal to practice any of those religions, etc. But that doesn't mean that it was not a hierarchical society, and that there weren't ways in which Christians and Jews were discriminated against, but it was in many very real ways far more tolerant than the triumphant Christian kingdoms would become later. So whatever the limits of this convivencia was, Islamic and Jewish presence deeply shaped Spanish culture for those 700 years in terms of Islamic culture, particularly in the southern part of Spain. Muslim and Jewish spirituality and culture left a mark on Spanish literature, art and architecture, science, language, as well as people's individual practices and worldviews. And during the long period of Muslim rule and the gradual reconquest, most people's primary identity still remained local. They understood themselves to be from their neighborhood, their city, their town, and only then a part of something larger, their kingdom, like Castile, Aragon, Portugal, Leon, Granada, etc. But they didn't think of themselves as Spanish. At this level, local practices flourished, like devotion to particular saints, or various ways of celebrating particular religious festivals, or particular social structures and political organizations. But at the same time, particularly in the independent Christian kingdoms, another level of identity was starting to develop that united people beyond these smaller circles of neighborhood and town and city and kingdom. People began to think of themselves also as Christians, as a kind of political pan-Iberian identity. And not just Christians, but Christians who shared a long history of living under foreign rule. And in this way, Christianity becomes a political identity, an ethnic identity. It actually always was, but you can really see in this moment how it is understood. Christian is not a belief system only at all. It is a national identity or an ethnic identity, and the thought of being under foreign rule, invaders from Northern Africa, is as much about culture and religion as it is about geography. So that's what I want to say here. So there's this strong feeling growing that that Christians in these newly independent kingdoms had survived this long, difficult era of being ruled by infidels, and that their experiences of waging war against this enemy united them as Christians in this particular part of the world who had survived that. So this growing larger level of identity, together also with the fervor of successful independence struggles, bled into the fervor of crusades. And there's a long history of crusades that even predates the Reconquista. But as kingdoms freed themselves in the Iberian Peninsula, they also started sending people and resources and going to war in Muslim lands outside of the Iberian Peninsula. So going to the Middle East, going throughout Africa, going to places where Muslim rule existed beyond the Iberian Peninsula. And this begins to fuel that idea of a Christian Roman Empire that spans the whole world and basically a Christian world. And these crusades were brutal and bloody wars, as were the Reconquista wars. So a philosophy of just war started to develop, as in a just war, a war that is just. And some rules were developed to define a just war. And this was basically if a group of people refused to convert to Christianity, it was just to make war on them and to kill them. This was all in the name of the creation of a Christian empire, which some religious thinkers began to think was a necessary step before the return of Christ. So it started to bleed into interpretations of the last book of the New Testament, Revelations, and this political philosophy of imperial conquest. It wedded itself to an eschatological vision, a vision of the end of the world, a vision of salvation, etc. This long history of Christianity. And the idea was that reconquering all of these territories and reconquering the Holy Land, or conquering the Holy Land, was necessary before the return of Christ, before the end of days, before the return of Christ and his peaceful rule on earth, etc. So some Christian theologians and clergymen, many of them actually, believed that they were living in the days foretold by Revelations, that the long war against the enemy was what was described in Revelations and would give way to a glorious future of heaven on earth. And many in the Iberian Peninsula believed that someday a united Spain would play a central role in this biblical story. So from 711 to 1250, the frontier was steadily pushed southward, sometimes losing ground for a little while, which directed, but then reasserting ground. And during this long process, Castile eventually emerged as the dominant Christian kingdom, which directed and funded most of the war effort. And this is important because it's the political power of Castile that directs the exploration to the Americas, and that really arrives in the Americas. And it's why the Spanish that ends up becoming dominant in Latin America is Castilian Spanish. During this long process, I already said that. So in 1252, all of the Iberian Peninsula had fallen to Christian forces, except for the southern kingdom of Granada. And Granada was at this point, from 1250 to 1492, a long time, the only Muslim kingdom left. And it was a real stronghold. So for more than 200 years, the focus was on Granada. There were periods of no fighting and failed attacks and battles at the frontiers and borders for sure. But it was so it wasn't like 200 years of constant war everywhere. But the focus was always on when war was happening, when war could be mounted, when it could be funded. It was always focused on this for those 200 years, on that kingdom of Granada. But in 1469, the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile were united through the marriage of King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile, and this strengthened both kingdoms. And this unification had great symbolism because both of these monarchs were united in their primary focus of finally ridding the Iberian Peninsula of Islam. Not all the kings and queens equally thought that this was important, but Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand both did, and it was part of the reason why they got married and unified their kingdoms. So this desire led to a special relationship between these particular monarchs and the Pope in Rome. So Isabella and Ferdinand became known as the Catholic kings, and all of the kings and queens in the Spanish kingdom were Catholic. There was no other formal official Christianity in the region, but what this title meant was that they understood themselves to be special servants to the church and that they had the favor and ear of the Pope. The important thing to know about this is that in much of the medieval period, popes acted like kings. Rome was defended and ruled in some ways, in the same ways as other kingdoms. The Pope had armies and waged wars, but by the time of Isabella and Ferdinand, the military might of Rome and the Pope had grown a lot weaker and had come to depend on the power of these other kingdoms. And so he relied on them for the physical defense of Rome and the church. And Isabella and Ferdinand pledged their, complete strength to protect Rome and to further this vision of a Christian empire throughout the Iberian Peninsula. Nonetheless, the political power of the Pope was still enormous, and all monarchs relied on the church for legitimization of their power. If the Pope didn't recognize them, it was really hard for them to operate as legitimate monarchs in the region. Eventually, in the relationship between the Catholic kings and the Pope, the Spanish crown would be the stronger of the two. But the relationship was always understood as a partnership in which Isabella and Ferdinand owed their allegiance to the church and the Pope. In 1492, this relationship was solidified when Castilian forces finally drove the Muslims out of Granada. This was an enormous triumph for both Castile and for the Catholic Church. Granada was incorporated into the crown of Castile, so now we have Castile and Aragon and Granada united. And the monarch started to refer to this little kingdom, which was the unification of three kingdoms, a triple alliance, where have you heard that before, as the birth of Spain. So in 1492, not before, in 1492, Spain was born according to Ferdinand and Isabella, who united their two kingdoms and the kingdom of Granada and declared it to be the beginning of Spain. And from that, those three united kingdoms started pushing for the political unification of all the independent Christian nations in Spain. And slowly, more and more kingdoms would unite under a Spanish king that had its root in this Castilian-led triple alliance. So it and this was furthered in 1492 by this kind of widespread fervor all over the peninsula because of the fall of Granada. There was a big party, right? The long period of Muslim rule in the peninsula was finally over. So this, and also this kind of anti-Semitic, anti-Islamic fervor for religious purity, along with other kinds of economic tensions and geographic tensions, led Isabella and Ferdinand in that same year to expel all Jews who would not convert to Christianity from their kingdoms. So 1492, Granada falls. As you know, Columbus stumbles upon the Americas, and there's a declaration that says gives Jews the opportunity to convert. And if they don't convert, they are expelled. They have to leave all Spanish kingdoms. So there was a feeling of being victorious as Spanish Christians, even if Spain was a region made up of individual kingdoms. There was this fervor of war, of the triumph of war that did unite them. Castile, Aragon, Granada was really the kingdom that sent Columbus to the New World. And of course, this also happened in 1492. But when Isabella agreed to sanction Columbus's, crazy idea that he could find a new route to India by sailing in the opposite direction, after a number of other Iberian kings and queens had refused him, she did so out of this victorious, triumphant place. He came to her saying, basically, I had a vision and, this would be wonderful for your new kingdom, et cetera, et cetera. And there was this belief on the part of these kings that God was rewarding Castile for the long war against this enemy with the infidels, and that it was his will that Spain find new riches to support yet more wars in Africa and the Middle East and support the growth of a true Christian empire. So, the goal wasn't to go explore new continents. They didn't think that existed. The goal was to find an easier and more dependable route to India and bring back more money and, increase trade and increase the ability for Spain to be able to wage more war and to unify itself, etc. Or Castile, rather. The crown was not expecting to find new lands. They thought they knew what the whole world consisted of, but they thought that God would grant them access to trade routes and riches and victories in heathen lands where they would either convert or conquer infidels living there. And the church and the Pope supported this idea, and the church gave Ferdinand and Isabella powers that had never granted before to any other monarch. I'm not going to say too much about these powers because they become more important later, but I'll return to them later in another lecture. But for now, let me just say that the Pope gave the king two powers that would become really significant in Latin America. First, it allowed Ferdinand to set up a permanent inquisition. So there had been inquisitions before, but what these really meant is inquisitions. Think about what the word meant, to inquire, they had been temporary courts set up to investigate incidents of heresy and to root them out. And they were always, what's the word I'm trying to look for? They were always empowered or, legitimized. They were always allowed to be set up by the Pope, and they were temporary. But Ferdinand and Isabella requested from the Pope the ability to set up a permanent inquisition to focus on the religious errors of converted people. So religious errors of converted Jews and converted Muslims. So the church's inquisitorial courts had no jurisdiction over non-Christians. But once someone was baptized, then they were subject to the church's discipline and punishment. So in Castile and other Spanish kingdoms of this era, that had expelled all non-converted people who were not Christian, so everyone was officially Christian, there started this kind of growing distrust and fear and suspicion that people of Jewish and Islamic descent continued to harbor elements of the old faith and to practice them in secret. And we'll talk about this a little later too, about the way that this is a kind of racial ideology as well. People actually believed that even if people didn't remember that they had Jewish or Islamic heritage, ancestry, that the tendency to practice these elements of what we would call religions actually literally was transferred in the blood. So there was this biological, they didn't use that term, but kind of genealogical, biological, physical, racial concept of how what we would call religion, religious characteristics, religious behavior, etc., was passed on in the blood. So this fear that was cultural, religious, economic in many senses, and racial, led to this quest for religious purity. And Ferdinand and Isabella's desire to politically unite their kingdom, they used the Inquisition to further that goal by pressing for a kind of religious purity that also allowed them to control certain people and allowed them to bring people into their favor and create classes of informants who would help them do this. It's sort of a complicated, convoluted process, again, in which politics and religion really end up being one and the same. So the Inquisition, this permanent Inquisition, for the first 100 years it existed, was an extremely brutal institution. After that, it becomes a lot weaker, but that first 100 years, there was a lot of brutality associated with it. So that's one power that the Pope, this extraordinary power that it had never granted any other king or queen or any kind of political authority, was to establish a permanent Inquisition that was actually underneath the authority of the king and queen themselves. The other extraordinary power that the Pope bestowed on the Catholic kings, Ferdinand and Isabella, was known as the Patronato. And this would become even more important in Latin America. We'll talk about it more again in the future, but I want to define it for you quickly now. And it's basically the Pope had the power to appoint and approve of all other authority figures in the church, cardinals, bishops, and officially even priests, but priests that happen sort of at a more local level through either religious orders or through diocesan structures, which is priests. I'll probably have to draw a diagram for you about this, but basically there's the official hierarchical church, and it also comes down from Rome. But the Patronato interrupted that and said that the king, within the growing region of Spain, and then eventually Latin America, all of Spain's lands, the Spanish king, had the power to appoint bishops, had the power to appoint all clergy. Of course, again, the individual priests were more under the authority of either the bishops or religious orders, but at the diocesan level, the bishops then came to be directly under the authority of the king and appointed by the king. So in this instance, there is no separation between the church and state, even less than there was before. And the bishops answer to the king, not really to Rome. They answer to the king first. And certainly were at least appointed by the king. And so the king could handpick the kind of upper clergy, the kind of religious hierarchy that existed there. Okay, I have a few more minutes. I'm not going to be able to get through this particular whole lecture, so it'll be part one. So this is the Spain that was being born just at the moment before people from the Iberian Peninsula landed on the shores of the Americas. It was a region whose sense of identity had been forged through religious nationalist war. It was a set of kingdoms trying to deny the Muslim and Jewish parts of themselves, trying to eradicate the long history of convivencia, of coexistence, and all of the cultural legacies of Jews and Muslims. But it was at the same time truly a large and culturally diverse region with many local loyalties, local traditions, local languages, local religious practices, local cultural practices, etc. And politically dominant in this region was the Kingdom of Castile, with a very special relationship to the church. And from this kingdom, in certain circles, developed an especially fervent, passionate, and expansionist kind of religio-political vision. This vision, this brand of Christianity, this kind of political religious vision nurtured a dream of the return of the Roman Empire as a powerful Christian empire led by Spain, which would eventually rule the entire world. And for many theologians and religious leaders, and people like Isabella and Ferdinand themselves as well, this vision was connected to an apocalyptic vision that the end of days was very near, as predicted in the book of Revelations of the Bible. They really believed this. So it was in part this imperial, militaristic, expansionist, apocalyptic Christianity, urgent Christianity and culture and worldview, that arrived on the shores in the Caribbean and then Mexico, and eventually marched inland to meet the Aztec Empire and travel south to the Incan Empire. Ironically, this religio-political vision had some important things in common with the imperial religions of the Mexica and the Inca. These worldviews all believed that their right to rule was divinely inspired. So Spain, new birth of Spain, 100-year-old Triple Alliance Aztec Empire, 100-year-old Incan Empire, all believed that their right to rule was divinely inspired. They all believed they'd been directed to create an ever-expanding empire based on religious prophecy. And they all believed that they were living in a time that was very close to the end of the world. They had a lot in common in those ways, these imperial visions. But the Spaniards, who to their great shock and amazement discovered that there was a whole new world of lands and peoples that they'd never known about, were from a land that was only just beginning this imperial destiny, whereas the Inca and the Mexica came from lands in which these imperial destinies had risen and fallen, but also they had at least existed for 100 years with their own solidity about themselves as rulers. Some of these Spaniards carried with them the dreams of a Christian empire, and they talked about themselves as if they were Romans. It's really interesting, these kinds of early documents where they talked about themselves as Romans, as coming from a Roman empire. And some of them carried with them a fervent apocalyptic vision and a deep commitment to religious war that would bring about the end of days and the return of Christ. When we read some of the writings and reports that came to these people, they may sound to us like kind of crazed fanatics. Christopher Columbus himself was one of these people, but they were also actually representative of their era, which was a time of profound change and triumph and urgency. It was a heady, wild time, and it became even more so when they encountered the Americas and had to try to make sense of it and rewrite their whole biblical understanding. Where did these people come from? They really believed that they had reached an era in which Christianity had spread to the entire part of the globe. People had rejected it and therefore deserved to be waged war upon, if they were infidels, if they were Jews, if they were Muslims, etc. But the notion that there was a place where the story of Christianity had not arrived, and lands that were not accounted for in the biblical account of the globe, was mind-blowing. They had to rewrite everything that they thought they knew. But these people were also ordinary people, and they were people seeking a better future sometimes, trying to escape a bad situation. Truth be told, actually, even though it soon became illegal for anybody who had Jewish and Islamic ancestry to come to the Americas, lots did. Lots of people from those families were escaping persecution, kind of snuck their way on, and a lot of those people we now know actually, were protecting, particularly Jews, were protecting a Jewish faith and practicing in hiding. And so it's not that all the people that arrived in the Americas had a unified vision. It's just that vision that I talked about was extremely powerful, but there was a lot of ordinary people who carried a kind of diversity of language and culture and even religious beliefs. And although they were shaped by these larger forces and worldviews that I've just been describing, they also carried with them the day-to-day experiences of Christianity that I'll talk about in a moment, informed by particular local customs, informed by a particular relationship with nature and the geographies from which they came, and one that was lived and practiced as individuals, within families, and within communities and local traditions. And this is the kind of Christianity that also shaped the history of Latin America as it interacted with the local religions and cultural practices, etc., of the indigenous people. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. And I actually did get to the end of this one. I got to run because I'm going to see you in just a few moments.